I am Josh Burns.
I am Andrew Rourke, and this is Unshaken Truth, where we will examine the causes and impacts of wrongful convictions resulting from junk science like the shaken baby syndrome hypothesis and explore ways to end such miscarriages of justice.
Why us? Because we were wrongfully convicted of child abuse based on the now debunked shaken baby syndrome hypothesis, or SBS. We both spent years pursuing justice before finally being exonerated in 2024. In both of our cases, doctors ignored underlying medical causes for the children's condition and rushed to judgment based on flawed pseudoscience that has now led to countless wrongful convictions and shattered families' lives.
By digging into causes of junk science, wrongful convictions, and educating people about the problem, we can help make the criminal justice system accountable for the misuse of flawed evidence to put innocent people behind bars.
Around the same time we were exonerated in 2024, we learned about Robert Robertson, who was then facing imminent execution in Texas in a shaken baby syndrome case, despite a mountain of evidence proving that he, too, was an innocent man.
Robert's case horrified me. The idea that someone could be executed in a situation where there was actually no crime based on the exact same junk science of shaken baby that led to my wrongful conviction really shook me. His case is so similar to mine, except even worse. His daughter died. I sat there and I realized that had the child in my case died, I would be sitting right next to Robert on death row.
In our first season, Unshaken Truth will highlight Robert's case and feature guests who have been involved in the ongoing work to save his life. We want you to have a little background on Robert and his case before we take you to the episode. Robert is a person with autism spectrum disorder, but he was diagnosed only after his wrongful conviction.
Robert was convicted and sentenced to death after his toddler daughter, Nikki, who had been chronically ill her whole life, died in 2002.
There are lots of medical records that show what really caused Nikki's death. She was suffering from severe viral and bacterial pneumonia that had progressed to sepsis and a bleeding disorder. Nikki's respiratory symptoms were made worse by dangerous medications that should have never been prescribed to someone her age or in her condition. None of this was considered in Robert's case. Instead, hospital staff and law enforcement rushed to judgment, and he was convicted and sentenced to death based on the junk science shaken baby syndrome theory.
Parallels between Robert's case and mine are striking. Robert's execution was stayed in October of 2025 to allow an investigation of whether those similarities warrant relief in his case, just as I was finally exonerated.
The court will be considering that question soon, but we want to dig into these issues from our perspective and explore the unshaken truth about junk science wrongful convictions. Welcome to Unshaken Truth. I am Josh Burns, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Rourke. Today, we are talking to Keith Findley, who is a retired professor of law at the University of Wisconsin, co-founder of the Center for Integrity in Forensic Sciences, and co-founder of the Wisconsin Innocence Project. Thank you, Keith, for being with us here today. We're really glad to have you here.
Hey, it's my pleasure to be with you guys, and thank you both for your courage and fortitude for getting the word out after the ordeals you've been through.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, Keith, I've got the first question for you today.
Okay.
You've worked on cases involving disputed shaken baby syndrome diagnoses. What first made you question the reliability of this hypothesis?
It began in the early 2000s for me when I was the co-director of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, and I was working with some law students, and we got a request from a woman named Audrey Edmonds to help her. She'd been convicted in a pure shaking triad-based case of having shaken to death an infant in her care. She had been represented by some very good lawyers who were convinced she was absolutely innocent. So we decided to take a look into it. And at that point, I knew nothing about shaken baby syndrome. Uh,
Mm.
but we started looking into it and found that the original forensic pathologist who did the autopsy on the baby in that case had written a letter to to the Journal of the National Association of Medical Examiners, in which he basically expressed some doubts about some of the kinds of things that had been said at Audrey's trial by others and him as well, having to do with their certainty that there couldn't be a lucid interval, because he'd had a case where a child had clearly had an extended lucid interval. So he wrote a letter about that. My students called him up and said, "We want to talk to you about Audrey Edmonds." And the first thing out of his mouth was, "Oh, goodness, Audrey Edmonds. What are we going to do about Audrey Edmonds?"
Mm.
And
Wow.
so he recanted basically his testimony from her trial, and that clued us into some of the controversies that had emerged in the scientific literature. Um, and we started researching it, investigating it, and found how completely unverified, unvalidated the shaken baby syndrome hypothesis was, and
Mm.
how biomechanical research was suggesting that, in fact, shaking is a very unlikely mechanism of injury in these cases. And so we litigated it, and Audrey's case became the first case anywhere that I know of where the new science that cast doubt on this hypothesis was the basis for overturning a conviction, leading to her ultimate full exoneration when the state dismissed the charges.
Wow.
And when news got out about that, I started getting inquiries from all over the country, all over the world.
I
And
bet. Sure.
I haven't looked back. That's what I've been
Awesome.
doing since then.
Wow.
Keith, that's amazing. We are very familiar with Audrey's case, and that case has served, and Audrey has served as a pathfinder, for, like you said, for so many other cases. And we actually plan to have Audrey on the podcast.
Yeah.
We've been talking
Great.
to her. She'll be
She's
on next month sometime. Yeah,
That's great. She's an absolutely lovely person. Um,
totally. Yeah.
I think the world of Audrey.
Yeah, she's amazing. I've never officially gotten to the opportunity to meet her, but we're really looking forward to sitting down and talking with her.
Yeah, it's funny. My wife's reading that book right now.
The
Oh,
Audrey Edmonds book?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
So, how did shaken baby syndrome come to be treated as near certain proof of abuse in legal systems before the science was fully settled?
So the history of shaken baby syndrome is important to understand because it helps us understand how purely hypothetical it is, and what a weak foundation it rests on scientifically. The the hypothesis first emerged in 1971 when a pediatric neurosurgeon by the name of Dr. Norman Gauthkelch in Great Britain first published a very short 2-page article hypothesizing that maybe shaking was what was causing this strange constellation of findings he was seeing in his work. He was seeing children who show up with subdural hematomas, sometimes retinal hemorrhages,
Mhm.
and brain swelling, or sometimes encephalopathy, brain dysfunction, but no external signs of injury.
Mhm.
And he couldn't figure out what was going on till he met with some social workers in the north of England who told him at that time that shaking infants was a common and accepted form of disciplining or trying to quiet a crying baby. And so he just hypothesized, well, perhaps those rotational forces are sloshing the brain around inside the skull and causing these injuries. It wasn't really based on any scientific evidence. The only scientific evidence he could point to was some studies that had been done before that with monkeys, where
Mhm.
they had been put on a sled and impacted with a piston to cause severe whiplash.
Mm.
They
Um,
brought that up in my case too.
yeah,
Mm.
and those and that severe whiplash force had caused brain injury in these monkeys. Well,
Mhm.
the authors of that study later said, well, Dr. Gufkelch and others who followed him had misunderstood because the forces applied by that piston to that sled far, far, far exceeded anything that a human being could generate in manual shaking. But that was the only science they had. It was pure hypothesis after that. He never envisioned it, though, as a malicious or criminal act. He thought of it as innocuous shaking by caring, loving parents who just didn't understand that it might be posing a risk. So his remedy was an education campaign. A year later, in 1972, and then again in 1974, an American pediatric radiologist by the name of John Caffey picked up on the hypothesis and developed it a little bit further, published a couple of papers on it, still without really any scientific foundation for it, and expressly acknowledging this really hasn't been studied. The evidence base is meager, it's incomplete, but suggesting that if our hypothesis is correct, you're saying, then educating parents about the potential harms of shaking might save some children. Again, he viewed it as innocuous, well-intentioned shaking that and the remedy was education. So given that the harm to children that they were trying to address was pretty severe and sometimes fatal, and that the remedy they were proposing had no downside, it had no costs, they were just saying, let's tell parents to be careful, don't shake your children. It quickly latched on in the medical communities and became taught in medical schools. And because it sort of made sense theoretically and there was no real downside to it, it became embraced. It became not just hypothesis, but medical dogma in what was then known as the authoritarian era of medicine. In the authoritarian era of medicine, physicians just accepted what they were taught without demanding scientific confirmation, scientific evidence to support it. And so it widely became taught and widely became accepted. After a while, prosecutors began seeing this as a potential way to prosecute potential abusers. And so then this sort of synergistic relationship developed between medicine and law, where both were applying pressures on the other that pushed the hypothesis into ways they might not have gone on their own. And ultimately, in 1993, the American Academy of Pediatrics published its first position paper on shaken baby syndrome. By then, prosecutors were trying to look at this as a source for a basis for prosecuting people. And in that position paper, without citation to any additional science, the American Academy of Pediatrics ratcheted up the malevolence of the shaking from what Caffey and Guthkelch had hypothesized as innocuous and well-intentioned shaking. They now said the shaking would have to be done with such force that the person shaking the child would have to know it would be harmful and might even represent an intent to kill. Now the hypothesis has fully blossomed, not just as medical dogma, but as legal dogma. And both prosecutors and child abuse pediatricians now had an vested interest in maintaining that hypothesis because it was critical to the shared mission they had of rooting out child abuse and prosecuting abusers. So they latched onto it with a vengeance, driven by their well-intentioned desire to protect children from abuse, but glossing over the fact that there was no real science to support it. Right. So that is essentially how this became so entrenched, when there was no scientific foundation for it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. How has the medical community's view of SBS changed over time? What role has the American Academy of Pediatrics played, and what about the research bodies like the National Academy of Sciences, which I believe have pushed for more scientific rigor in forensic evidence?
So the evolution of the shaken baby syndrome hypothesis has really been fairly significant and pretty telling, but in ways that the child abuse pediatrics community refuses to acknowledge. Even while they modify their hypothesis on the basis of the new science, they refuse to acknowledge that anything has really changed. But we know it's changed. We can track that simply by looking at the ways they used to testify, the things that were in their textbooks, and even perhaps most tellingly, the things that were published as their official positions by the American Academy of Pediatrics in their position papers. So, for example, in 1993 and again in 2001, the American Academy of Pediatrics called for a presumption of abuse anytime an infant showed up with any kind of intracranial injury, a presumption of abuse, right?
Yeah.
And they said that there wasn't really anything else that could cause this other than perhaps a high-speed motor vehicle accident or a multi-story fall. There was really no science to support any of that either, but that was their official position through the 90s and into the early 2000s.
Wow.
And they really recognized very little as alternative possible causes. In fact, at one point they said the only alternatives for subdural hematoma are shaking injury or accidental injury or inflicted trauma or accidental injury. They didn't recognize any medical causes.
Right.
And they ruled out the accidental because they then published papers that said explicitly in those same position papers, they said explicitly this constellation of findings is not caused by short falls. So accidents were ruled out unequivocally. Well, the science progressed to the point where it became obvious that, in fact, there was a long list of things that could cause all of the findings attributed to shaken baby syndrome, everything ranging from inflicted trauma to accidental trauma, but also including a wide range of medical conditions, genetic abnormalities, bleeding disorders, childhood stroke, infection. You go on, the list goes on and on and on.
Sure.
And so by 2009, when they published their next position paper on shaken baby syndrome, gone was the reference to a presumption of abuse. And instead, what they said was, like any other diagnosis, you have to do a full differential diagnosis. A differential diagnosis is simply the process that physicians use throughout medicine when they're trying to reach a diagnosis, whereby they collect a list of everything that could be the cause of the medical findings they're seeing. They have to scientifically rule them all in. And then they systematically, through other testing or history or whatever it may be, they rule them out until they're left with the one that is the ultimate diagnosis. So that calling for a differential diagnosis means you can't presume abuse anymore. You have to consider all of these alternatives that are real. So we see that dramatic shift. In the early days as well, the literature was full of references to the fact that retinal hemorrhages were virtually, and this was in their publications, in the literature, were virtually pathognomonic for abuse and for shaking abuse. Pathognomonic meaning exclusively diagnostic. Nothing else can cause it.
Yeah.
When research began emerging showing that a lot of things can cause retinal hemorrhages, anything causing increased intracranial pressure, including natural childbirth, can cause retinal hemorrhages, can cause subdural hematomas, can cause all of that. They backed off from that and no longer claimed that retinal hemorrhages per se were pathognomonic, but now they started saying, well, it's a particular type of retinal hemorrhages. Those that are multi-layered, extensive, too numerous to count, and extending to the periphery or the ora serrata, those, they started saying, those are distinctive for abuse. Well,
yes.
Now the science has shown that even those extensive, too numerous to count retinal hemorrhages extending to the ora serrata, those are actually also found sometimes in other conditions as well. And so now the literature is backed off and it says there are no pathognomonic eye findings. The retinal hemorrhages are still important, they say, but they're not pathognomonic. So we see that kind of shift. In some of the more recent papers in 2020, 2018, we see them expressly acknowledging now that shortfalls can kill. The shortfalls completely contradictory to the absolute categorical claim that was made in 1993 and 2001 that the shortfalls cannot cause these findings. The newer papers now say, well, the mortality of some shortfall incidents has been now reported. We recognize it. Now their response simply is, yeah, but it's really rare. And so they
Right.
want people to disregard it because they say that's really rare. Well,
Yeah.
rare doesn't mean never.
Sure.
So if it can
Right.
happen, you can't just ignore it. You have to find a way to rule that out when you're considering the differential diagnosis.
Yeah.
As recently as last year, um, when the National Academy of Sciences published its in-depth look at forensic pathology, the National Academy of Sciences expressly noted that it's become even controversial as to whether shaking alone can even cause any of these kinds of findings.
Mm.
And the National Academy of Sciences has called for rigorous scientific foundations for all of the forensic sciences, including medical diagnosis of abuse. So we can trace the shifts over time. They're there. They're in black and white on paper, where they've had to back off of really aggressive stances they've taken in the past that have been proven to be false by science. And now courts are starting to recognize that, such as the courts in your cases,
Sure.
and perhaps most dramatically in the published opinion in Andrew Rourke's case, where the court
Yeah.
said, all of this has changed now. The science is different.
Yes. Yeah. Kind of a follow-up question, Keith. When we talk about their literature on the side of child abuse pediatricians and abusive head trauma, shaken baby syndrome literature, I've heard a lot of folks argue that they don't really peer review their research. They kind of stay in their circles of research. What do you think about that? Do they actually look outside of their own peers, or do they just circle the wagons when they publish those papers?
I don't know what happens with the peer review process inside those journals.
Mhm.
th- a lot of this literature is published in peer reviewed journals, but a journal called Pediatrics, which is the leading one, would probably reach out to pediatricians,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
their academy expressly endorses the hypothesis. So, uh,
Yeah.
it's widely known that in all kinds of scientific research circles that while peer review is an important process, it doesn't guarantee reliability or validity of
Sure.
published papers. That a lot of junk gets published even in the peer review process. So yes,
Right.
it's important, but it doesn't mean that it's all true or even that it's all good science.
Right.
And there's no question that the child abuse pediatrics community has circled the wagons as much as they can,
Right.
in that they have tried to claim for themselves the sole right and authority to render opinions on shaken baby syndrome and abusive head trauma, trying to say we are the only ones with expertise in this,
Mm.
which is an facially absurd claim, given that child abuse, abusive head trauma, shaken baby syndrome are inherently um, multidisciplinary. Yes, pediatrics is part of it, but so is forensic pathology. After all, that's the discipline that's trained to determine cause and manner of death.
Sure.
And so do all of the other disciplines that might say something about alternative causes of a child's demise, which can range from cardiology to hematology to, yeah, you name it. Plus, fundamentally, the question of abusive head trauma and shaken baby syndrome ultimately rests on a foundation that is biomechanical,
Right.
because their hypothesis is we can tell what some certain forces applied by an external person to the body of this child that caused these findings. Well, that's a biomechanical question. Biomechanics is the study of the effects of force applied to the body. That's
Right.
not a medical question. That's a biomechanical question. And so to try to exclude biomechanics from and say we're the only ones who have anything to say about this is the utmost in circling the wagons and excluding what is really what probably one of the most important scientific inquiries into the whole field. And that's expressly why, for example, the Supreme Court of New Jersey recently ruled in the Nieves decision
Yes.
that shaken baby syndrome is inadmissible because it's fundamentally a biomechanical question, and biomechanics suggests that it's not real, that it's flawed.
Yep.
Right. Yeah, that just seems like common sense, Keith. You know, everyone needs to stay within their lane of expertise, and we all refer to subject matter experts
Yeah,
if it's
yeah.
outside our lane.
So, in these cases, can you break down the role a child abuse pediatrician play? But first, can you explain what a CAP is? How are they trained? How are they
Sure.
typically introduced to juries? And are they truly qualified to offer expert opinions about the mechanics of injury?
Sure. So, child abuse pediatricians, or CAPS is the
Right.
acronym, are the pediatricians who specialize in looking for, investigating, and rendering opinions about possible child abuse. It is a board certified specialty. The board certification didn't exist until fairly recently when the pediatricians created this new board certification. Um, I don't know what the special training is in particular, but they have to pass an exam. To pass the exam, one has to accept the foundations of the shaken baby syndrome hypothesis and be ready to expound on it in the exam. So it is in that sense, sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, an insular group that defines its own membership in part based on acceptance of this controversial hypothesis. Child abuse pediatricians, no doubt, have a lot of expertise and specialized knowledge in pediatrics, but they don't have any specialized knowledge in biomechanics, which
Right.
we just talked about as being sort of a fundamental and foundational problem. They
Mhm.
also don't have particularized expertise in some of the other things that can cause the findings associated with shaken baby syndrome, whether it's a genetic abnormality or a heart defect or a bleeding disorder or a pulmonary problem. They don't have they aren't the specialists in those subdisciplines. There are people who are board certified in those particular areas.
Okay.
And so it's really important that they be willing to yield to the experts in those disciplines when they render an opinion about alternatives. But what we see is they don't. They claim for themselves the ultimate authority to be the determiners of whether a child was abused, shaken, impacted, or whatever. Um, they are typically they are sometimes treating physicians, but more often than not, they're consulting physicians who are brought in when others suspect possible child abuse based on what? Well, based on the findings that the child abuse pediatricians tell them to look for.
Right.
Subdural hematomas, retinal hemorrhages, whatever it may be. And they come in and then render an opinion. And my experience talking with physicians in a lot of disciplines is that once the cap comes in, and renders an opinion, everyone else just sort of backs off.
Right.
Not appropriate, not the way it should be, but they take over. They sort of dominate the domain.
And they
Whenever
end up being the final word.
they become the final word. And there's one other thing that's kind of troubling about that, and that is what we know that cognitive biases play a profound distorting effect in all kinds of determinations that we as human beings make all the time. And that includes in medicine and other types of areas where expertise is applied. In medicine, one of the most profound and difficult cognitive biases, by cognitive bias, we mean just the sort of the mental shortcuts we use all the time that are useful to us in ordinary life, but can lead us astray sometimes. one of the most problematic ones that's very common in medicine is something known as the availability heuristic or the representativeness error. And what that is a tendency that people have, and particularly doctors, when they're particularly familiar with or look for or accustomed to diagnosing a particular thing, there's a tendency when you see findings that could fit that diagnosis, there's a tendency to to gravitate towards it, to render an opinion based on that, even if it's not the real cause in a particular given case. That's a profound risk when you have a community of doctors who are dedicated to finding and rooting out child abuse, that they are going to latch on to that in their well-intentioned desire to protect children from child abuse. So that can be a particular problem with this as well. And they will often say, yes, but and in fact, they say this in some of their most recent publications. Well, but we guard against bias by putting together multidisciplinary teams. The problem with that is those multidisciplinary teams, they don't cite any research to show that those multidisciplinary teams reduce bias. And there's no reason to think that they do. When you consider that the multidisciplinary teams are made up of the child abuse pediatricians, social workers from Child and Protective Services, often police officers, sometimes prosecutors, they're all people who are sharing the same advocacy-driven mission of protecting children from abuse and who are vulnerable, therefore, to seeing abuse wherever they look, if they're not careful enough.
Right.
And they are vulnerable to another type of cognitive bias called groupthink, where the people tend to align their thinking with that of others in their group. Involving others in a discipline can minimize bias, but only if those others are not if they're not part of the same decision-making group, and if they're not provided the conclusions and assumptions and rationale of others who've already made a decision. That is, if they are doing blind reads of the same material, that can be a check against bias. But these multidisciplinary teams are the opposite of a blind check. They are a groupthink process.
Right.
Yeah.
I would really like to see the record of how many they've gotten wrong to how many they've gotten right.
Well, that's a very hard question to answer, though, because there's nobody has any access to ground truth.
Right.
So there's no gold standard diagnostic test. Nobody has a way of knowing for sure what the truth is in any given case, which is also why this diagnosis is so problematic. Because without access to ground truth, physicians in this realm never get feedback that tells them they were wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Without that kind of
problem.
feedback, experience, the kind of experience they have is the kind of experience that is incapable of learning. You can't learn from experience if you never get feedback. It could be that this child abuse physician has called it, whenever they see these particular findings, they've called it child abuse every single time. And every time they do it, they see it as more experience that supports their diagnosis, when it could be that they've called it wrong every single time and just never do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Keith, one of the things that, with what you were talking about with this bias and this groupthink, that I can relate it to in my profession. You know, I've been an airline pilot for years now. I've trained pilots for the airlines for years. And, you know, we had to combat against expectation bias, where pilots, you know, in the 1970s and 80s, there were a lot of airline crashes. So we had to go to people outside of our sphere of influence. We actually went to some leading universities that do human factors studies, and we had to figure out that we were having pilots and captains were saying, I've seen this before, expectation biased, and it was suddenly something they haven't seen before with an airplane, and you've got 150 people in the back, right? And we had to make changes to make flying safer for the public. But that involved going outside of our peer group, going outside of our sphere of influence and our circles, and involving human factors experts to help
Yes.
us
Yes.
evaluate that and figure out where our shortcomings were, where our blind spots were. And to me, you know, I think that we have to have that standard in medicine, in child abuse, pediatrics, because it's just a dangerous place to live if we're not willing to get that feedback and glean what we can from other experts outside of our peers and circles, I guess, you know?
That's such a great point, and it's so absolutely important. And one of the things that's rather telling about child abuse medicine is that instead of embracing that model, which is really the scientific model, you go outside your sphere, you go outside your thinking, and you try to find as many people as possible to play devil's advocates, to punch holes in your hypothesis, in your theory,
Yeah,
because that's how you know that's how you get closer and closer to truth, is if you continually try to disprove your hypothesis, and if you can't disprove it, the hypothesis becomes stronger. So that's really what the way science moves. But in the child abuse medicine context, we see the opposite happening. We
right,
see the child abuse pediatricians trying to shut down all criticisms of the hypothesis, of trying to close off dissent, of trying to stifle debate, instead of trying to embrace it, take it seriously, and engage in thorough scientific um, examination. And why do I
right,
say that? I say it because, as I said, the child abuse pediatricians like to claim for themselves the exclusive authority and ability to make these determinations. But when people publish scientific pieces critical of the hypothesis, they are subjected to horrendous ostracism, ridicule. There have been requests to get their published papers,
right,
letters to their employers saying these people are dangerous, they should be terminated. There have been several instances when critics who offered expert testimony have been prosecuted
right.
for
Yeah,
perjury for their testimony.
yeah.
Dr. One of the Dr. John Plunkett, one of
John
the
Plunkett, for
leading
Plunkett.
sure.
giants
Yeah,
as a critic of shaken baby syndrome, who's now sadly passed away.
right,
But he was prosecuted criminally for perjury because he testified in a shaken baby syndrome case on behalf of the defendant. He was acquitted. It was utter nonsense. But these are all attempts to shut down legitimate scientific debate and inquiry rather than engage it and resolve it on its scientific merits. We also see it in things like lots of published pieces in the literature where they call people who are critics, they call them anti-science.
right.
They call them
Mhm.
child abuse denialists. Well,
Yep.
I'm sorry, but bringing rigorous scientific standards to bear on on child abuse literature is not anti-science. It's the essence of science.
Yes,
And nobody is a child abuse denialist. Everybody recognizes that child abuse is real, that
of
it
course.
happens, that it can take the form of abusive head trauma, and
Mhm.
even that shaking is not a safe thing to do to a child.
Right.
Right,
Nobody denies those things. What's in dispute and what's being denied is that the scientific foundation is there to establish that shaking alone can cause these kinds of brain injuries, especially
hmm,
without causing neck injuries, or that a physician can look at these changing, shifting, amorphous lists of non-specific medical findings and somehow from that make a determination that they know what forces were applied to the body, who did it, and with what mental state. That is, it wasn't accidentally. That's
right.
what's being challenged. Those
Yeah,
are the kinds of things, or challenge that that physicians say they can time when the injuries occur, even though we now know from extensive literature that timing is unreliable and that children with these brain injuries can sometimes experience periods of hours or even days of relative lucidity after suffering the brain injury before they ultimately collapse. So
mm.
those are legitimate scientific debates, and to lump that together as child abuse denialists is just another heavy-handed way to stifle legitimate scientific debate.
Thank you for listening to Unshaken Truth. Join us next week as we continue our conversation with Keith Findley. Unshaken Truth's first season will drop new episodes on most Thursdays and will be available on YouTube, Apple Podcast, and Spotify. Links to episodes and other materials are available on the show's website at unshakentruth.com. Listeners can contact us through the Justice Corner on our website, named after my dog Justice.